The good we secure for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secured for all of us and incorporated into our common life. What, after all, has maintained the human race on this old globe, despite all the calamities of nature and all the tragic failings of mankind, if not faith in new possibilities and courage to advocate them? Much of the insensibility and hardness of the world is due to the lack of imagination, which prevents a realization of the experiences of other people. We forget that the accumulation of knowledge and the holding of convictions must finally result in the application of that knowledge and those convictions to life itself. I believe that peace is not merely an absence of war, but the nurture of human life, and that in time this nurture would do away with war as a natural process. We stand today united in a belief in beauty, genius, and courage, and that these can transform the world. That person is most cultivated who is able to put himself in the place of the greatest number of other persons. A woman should have the ballot, because without this responsibility she cannot best develop her moral courage. It is easy to become the dupe of a deferred purpose, of the promise the future can never keep, and I had fallen into the meanest type of self-deception in making myself believe that all this was in preparation for great things to come. Hundreds of poor, laboring men and women are being thrown into jails and police stations because of their political beliefs. In fact, an attempt is being made to deport an entire political party. Perhaps nothing is so fraught with significance as the human hand. We are learning that a standard of social ethics is not attained by traveling a sequestered byway, but by mixing on the thronged and common road, where all must turn out for one another and at least see the size of one another's burdens. The impulse to share the lives of the poor, the desire to make social service, irrespective of propaganda, express the spirit of Christ, is as old as Christianity itself. In his own way, each man must struggle, lest the moral law become a far-off abstraction utterly separated from his active life. National events determine our ideals as much as our ideals determine national events. When the entire moral energy of an individual goes into the cultivation of personal integrity, we all know how unlovely the result may become. The character is a pride, of course, but too coated over with the result of its own endeavor to be attractive. It is easy to become the dupe of a deferred purpose of the promise the future can never keep. That which may have sounded like righteous teaching when it was remote and wordy will be challenged afresh when it is obliged to simulate life itself. Pliable human nature is relentlessly pressed upon by its physical environment to attain individual morality in an age demanding social morality, to pride oneself on the results of personal effort when the time demands social adjustment, is utterly to fail to apprehend the situation. The task of youth is not only its own salvation, but the salvation of those against whom it rebels. But in that case there must be something vital to rebel against, and if the elderly stiffly refuse to put up a vigorous front of their own, it leaves the entire situation in a mist. I am not one of those who believe, broadly speaking, that women are better than men. We have not wrecked railroads, nor corrupted legislatures, nor done many unholy things that men have done, but then we must remember that we have not had the chance. The cheap drama brings cause and effect, will, power, and action once more into relation, and gives a man the thrilling conviction that he may yet be master of his fate. The blessing which we associate with a life of refinement and cultivation can be made universal, and must be made universal if they are to be permanent, must be grounded in a philosophy whose foundation is on the solidarity of the human race, a philosophy which will not waver when the race happens to be represented by a drunken woman or an idiot boy. But the paradox is here: when cultivated people do stay away from a certain portion of the population, when all social advantages are persistently withheld, it may be for years, the result itself is pointed to as a reason, and is used as an argument for the continued withholding. No one so poignantly realizes the failures in the social structure as the man at the bottom, who has been most directly in contact with those failures and has suffered most. Even death itself sometimes fails to bring the dignity and serenity which one would fain associate with old age. The task of youth is not only its own salvation, but the salvation of those against whom it rebels. Only in time of fear is government thrown back to its primitive and sole function of self-defense, and the many interests of which it is the guardian become subordinate to that. The rich landlord is he who collects with sternness, who accepts no excuse, and will have his own. There are moments of irritation and of real bitterness against him, but there is still admiration because he is rich and successful. In this effort toward a higher morality in our social relations, we must demand that the individual shall be willing to lose the sense of personal achievement and shall be content to realize his activity only in connection with the activity of the many. A wise man has told us that men are once for all so made that they prefer a rational world to believe in and live in. All those hints and glimpses of a larger and more satisfying democracy which literature and our own hopes supply have a tendency to slip away from us and to leave us sadly unguided and perplexed when we attempt to act upon them. With all the efforts made by modern society to nurture and educate the young, how stupid it is to permit the mothers of young children to spend themselves in the coarser work of the world. Private beneficence is totally inadequate to deal with the vast numbers of the city's disinherited. Life cannot be administered by definite rules and regulations. That wisdom to deal with a man's difficulties comes only through some knowledge of his life and habits as a whole. It is well to remind ourselves from time to time that ethics is but another word for righteousness, that for which many men and women of every generation have hungered and thirsted, and without which life becomes meaningless. If in a democratic country nothing can be permanently achieved save through the masses of the people, it will be impossible to establish a higher political life than the people themselves crave. I dreamed night after night that everyone in the world was dead, excepting myself, and that upon me rested the responsibility of making a wagon wheel. Hospitality still survives among foreigners, although it is buried under false pride among the poorest Americans. This dream that men shall cease to waste strength in competition and shall come to pool their powers of production is coming to pass all over the earth. Intellectual life requires for its expansion and manifestation the influences and assimilation of the interests and affections of others. A settlement is above all a place for enthusiasms, a spot to which those who have a passion for the equalization of human joys and opportunities are early attracted. Perhaps nothing is so fraught with significance as the human hand, this oldest tool with which man has dug his way from savagery and with which he is constantly groping forward. As democracy modifies our conception of life, it constantly raises the value and function of each member of the community, however humble he may be. A very little familiarity with the poor districts of any city is sufficient to show how primitive and genuine are the neighborly relations. The worth of every conviction consists precisely in the steadfastness with which it is held. We are thus brought to a conception of democracy, not merely as a sentiment which desires the well-being of all men, nor yet as a creed which believes in the essential dignity and equality of all men, but as that which affords a rule of living as well as a test of faith. One's faith is kept alive as one occasionally meets a realized ideal of better human relations. The common stock of intellectual enjoyment should not be difficult of access because of the economic position of him who would approach it. If the settlement seeks its expression through social activity, it must learn the difference between mere social unrest and spiritual impulse. The lessons of great men and women are lost unless they reinforce upon our minds the highest demands which we make upon ourselves. They are lost unless they drive our sluggish wills forward in the direction of their highest ideas. A long-established occupation may form the very foundations of the moral life, that the art with which a man has solaced his toil may be the salvation of his uncertain temperament. It is as easy for most of us to keep from stealing our dinners as it is to digest them, and there is quite as much voluntary morality involved in one process as the other. You do not know what life means when all the difficulties are removed. Social advance depends as much upon the process through which it is secured as upon the result itself. The classical city promoted play with careful solicitude, building the theater and stadium as it built the marketplace and the temple. The supreme religious test of our social order is the hideous commerce of prostitution. The new growth in the plant, swelling against the sheath, which at the same time imprisons and protects it, must still be the truest type of progress. The mass of men seldom move together without an emotional incentive. In the unceasing ebb and flow of justice and oppression, we must all dig channels as best we may, that at the propitious moment somewhat of the swelling tide may be conducted to the barren places of life. Nothing could be worse than the fear that one had given up too soon and left one unexpended effort that might have saved the world. Laura Jane Addams, September 6, 1860 May 21st, 1935, born in Centerville, Illinois. Jane Addams was the youngest of 8 children born into a prosperous northern Illinois family of English-American descent which traced back to colonial Pennsylvania. In 1863, when Addams was 2 years old, her mother, Sarah Addams Weber, died while pregnant with her 9th child. Thereafter, Addams was cared for mostly by her older sisters. By the time Addams was 8, 4 of her siblings had died, 3 in infancy and 1 at the age of 16. Jane Addams was an American settlement activist, reformer, social worker, sociologist, public administrator, philosopher, and author. She was a leader in the history of social work and women's suffrage in the United States. Addams co-founded Hull House, one of America's most famous settlement houses, in Chicago, Illinois, providing extensive social services to poor, largely immigrant families. In 1910, Addams was awarded an honorary Master of Arts degree from Yale University, becoming the first woman to receive an honorary degree from the school. In 1920, she was a co-founder of the American Civil Liberties Union ACLU. Addams spent her childhood playing outdoors, reading indoors, and attending Sunday school. When she was 4, she contracted tuberculosis of the spine, known as Potts's disease, which caused a curvature in her spine and lifelong health problems. This made it complicated as a child to function with the other children, considering she had a limp and could not run as well. As a child, she thought she was ugly, and later remembered wanting not to embarrass her father. Jane Addams adored her father, John H. Addams, when she was a child. Her father was an agricultural businessman with large timber, cattle, and agricultural holdings, flour and timber mills, and a wool factory. He was the president of the Second National Bank of Freeport. During her childhood, Addams had big dreams of doing something useful in the world. As a voracious reader, she became interested in the poor from her reading of Charles Dickens. Inspired by his works and by her own mother's kindness to the Centerville poor, Addams decided to become a doctor so that she could live and work among the poor. Addams's father encouraged her to pursue higher education, but close to home, she was eager to attend the new college for women, Smith College in Massachusetts, but her father required her to attend nearby Rockford Female Seminary, now Rockford University, in Rockford, Illinois. Jane and Alice completed their first year of medical school at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, but Jane's health problems, a spinal operation and a nervous breakdown prevented her from completing the degree. She wrote long letters to her friend from Rockford Seminary, Ellen Gates Starr, mostly about Christianity and books, but sometimes about her despair. Her nephew was James Weber Lynn 1876139, who taught English at the University of Chicago and served in the Illinois General Assembly. Lynn also wrote books and newspaper articles. An advocate for world peace and recognized as the founder of the social work profession in the United States. In 1931, Addams became the first American woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She was a radical pragmatist and arguably the first woman public philosopher in the United States. In the Progressive Era, when presidents such as Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson identified themselves as reformers and social activists, Addams was one of the most prominent reformers. She helped America address and focus on issues that were of concern to mothers, such as the needs of children, local public health, and world peace. In her essay Utilization of Women in City Government, Addams noted the connection between the workings of government and the household, stating that many departments of government, such as sanitation and the schooling of children, could be traced back to traditional women's roles in the private sphere. When she died in 1935, Addams was the best-known female public figure in the United States.